I'm, like Carlos said, I'm Mike Chavez, and so today what I'm going to cover is scoping for complicated projects. What I kind of want to talk about mostly is how we're also not only, this assignment cutting off that last third of the environmental process, but some of the tools that we've implemented on that beginning 2/3 portion. Some of the ways that we can, collaborate, communicate, and concur with the districts and local governments on some of these projects that they're putting together. So that's what I'm going to be covering. But I'm going to go over types of scoping, what kind of scoping I'm specifically talking about first. Then I'm going to go quickly over our environmental review process. Then I'll get into how we're tackling scoping and some of the tools that we're using, core team, and the scope development tool that was discussed earlier. All right. If you get nothing out of this, I just want you to know that we are actively looking at having better communication, collaboration, and concurrence on these projects earlier in the process, at the point of project initiation as far as the environmental process is concerned. And so that is what these tools are supposed to initiate and supposed to help, so that when that back and forth that was discussed can lessen. Can be that, well, we already know what the project's coming in, we've already discussed what we expect to see, and so some of that process is just really cut down and further shortening that process. All right, so types of scoping. There's a lot of words on here, don't worry about it. I just kind of want to talk about the 3 basic scoping types that we're all kind of basically familiar with. There's the contract scope of work. It discusses deliverables, the money aspect, what you're negotiating with your subcontractors and the consultants and things like that. And it talks about, what items that we are expecting to see, what work is going to be done for the project. Then we have what's NEPA scoping, and that's specific to an EIS level document. And that essentially is just bringing in the agency into the discussion, bringing out the public. And so that's more for an EIS, but it still does qualify for most of the projects that we have. And then what I'm going to be talking about with is our Texas Administrative Code scoping. And that's our kind of inner discussion on what needs to be done. Deliverables, work to be done. All these things identify what needs to be done and the schedule of what things are going to be accomplished. All right, so our environmental review process. It pretty much starts out with scoping, and I just kind of want to show where it's located in this process, which is the baseline. It establishes what's going to be done, and then it just funnels it to our eventual environmental decision. By having everything established here early on and getting that schedule firm and hopefully tight, we're able to identify any kind of hiccups early on, any potential constraints, any kind of anything that's going to further make this whole process last a lot longer. Because I know there's a lot of engineers in the room. All you're really interested in is the environmental decision, and so that we can further process. Well, some of these tools that we use bring you into the process, and you can understand the time constraints and some of the design constraints that we have to deal with and what that means for the time frame. And I'll get into those later. All right, so here's the scoping process. We go from planning, initially identifying these projects, into the project initiation. And that's usually when the district staff learns about the project and is starting to initially look at the constraints and identify what needs to be done. Then you have the core team formation. The district will get a hold of E&V and we identify a team, a core team of individuals to do the discussion, the communication, collaboration on what has to be done. Then we go through an initial assessment, kind of basically identifying what level of documentation is going to be needed, whether it's to be a CE, to an EA, to even an EIS level document. And if you're not familiar with these terms, I can go into it, but it just, as far as we're concerned, CE, short amount of time, EA, a little longer, EIS, forever. Review, planning, studies. We just kind of look at some of the early studies that have been done by the planning department, way of identifying some of those initial constraints, seeing what we can take from those. It's kind of getting back to some of the FHWA initiatives on planning and environmental linkages, kind of bringing in some of that early work and seeing how it can shorten our time frame. Then we do an early constraints analysis. A lot of the consultants are already doing this already when they're putting together their scope of work. They've already kind of identified some of those early constraints with the project and the project area. And it kind of helps well, lets them know what they need to be doing. So we've worked that into our schedule just so that we can identify and help us to formally develop the scope. And that comes down into us putting it down on the paper. Like Sue was talking about, we have to document everything. So we document all that decision making and all the items that we reviewed to determine what needs to be done in that schedule. And that goes into either ECOS, if it's a TxDOT sponsored project, or we still have a paper scope form for a local government project. And one of the tools that we have, and was previously discussed, is a scope development tool, and I'll definitely discuss that. And then we go on to preparing the draft EA and the EIS. All right, so the core team. This is one of the new tools that we're using now. The core team consists of an ENV project delivery manager. Myself, there's about 8 others of us that are assigned to each EA and EIS level project. And then we have the district environmental project manager. And that's somebody at the district level who is helping to funnel it through. And those two collaborate on all project decisions and review all project deliverables. All right, and then that core team can bring in other members, other people who are going to be integral parts of that whole process, which includes the local government sponsor representatives on those local government projects, consultants. They're the ones who are doing the production of these documents. So you really want them in the room. We kind of identify, what we're expecting to see. We have that open discussion so that they're just not blindly looking for what they think we're looking for, but we have a discussion on what we do want to see. And we're really trying to open that communication line right there from the production team to the review team. Subject matter experts. We have all subject matter experts, as Sue identified, a way of different resources that we have experts on. And so we bring them into the discussion too on identifying what needs to be done for these projects, what the production team and the ones doing the investigation need to identify. So that communication is open before the work is done, so there's no surprises at the end. Planners. We can bring planners in so we can get some more of those numbers, those traffic numbers, some of the early work that was done early on, and providing some of that needed documentation for our purpose and need to kind of really justify our purpose and need for the project. Public involvement specialists. They help to bring in the public, keep that open line of communication. More complex projects necessitate more public involvement, more outreach methods, whether it be technical with technical work groups with, say, agencies and some of the other regulatory agencies that we're going to need approvals from or concurrence from, to public involvement teams, neighborhood committees, some city officials, or just kind of bringing some of the public in there and listening to their concerns. And then engineers. Bringing the engineers into the discussion when we have constraints, and one of the examples I'll get into is water. We have some acreage thresholds with permits with the Corps, and by identifying such constraints, that is an example, we're able to let you know what kind of time frames that we're limited to, what kind of constraints you have with regards to acreages and impacts on your footprint, and what kind of time frames we're looking at. All right, so the function of the core team, a lot of words, but this is coming out of our handbook, but the words I've underlined: communication, collaboration, and then reviewing, tracking, and managing, verifying, that's all kind of concurrence. So I just want you to know it's kind of written into our guidelines now how we're really trying to facilitate that communication. You're going to get tired of me saying communication, sorry. Scope development tool. This is our smart form that we're using right now, and it is a great tool. And basically it outlines all the information you know early on with your first initial knowledge of the project, some of those initial constraints that maybe the consultants have identified or the district team has identified. And this thing will shoot out what exactly needs to be done. And another benefit of this thing is that it identifies what does not need to be done. It gives you a negative statement on certain aspects that we can eliminate right now at scoping. And we have it documented in our file. So our document doesn't have to be a long, exhaustive text on things that have no impact now. Now we can just list them out, having reference to a scope development tool or just to scoping in general, and just jump right to those items that, that we may or may have initially identified as having a possible effect. So, all right. This is mostly for if this thing gets put online, but it just kind of tells you what the scope development does. Scope development tool. It just generates those findings and helps you kind of you know, establish what deliverables you need. And this tool is available online, and so it could be used at the district level prior to identifying a consultant. And it also, I've been told by some consultants, it's helped them to identify what needs to be done to help with their proposals too. So I mean, it's a tool that can be integrated throughout the process and can be used towards the end of the process. And if there's any kind of design change, you go back to the tool, do pop in any kind of changes you've identified, and then it'll tell you if there's any additional items that need to be done, or if it takes away some items. And so it's really a great tool. And if you get a chance, you can go play with it. So this is an example of our snapshot. And like I said, it just outlines by resources what needs to be done. So it's a kind of a to-do list just to check off. All right, so some examples of complex issues, and I mean that's what the my talk's supposed to be on mostly. But I wanted to give you some examples of how we're using that communication. An example, as I briefly discussed, is a PCN versus an individual IP acreage threshold. We're looking at half an acre. At 0.10 acres, you do not need any mitigation for whatever impacts you're having on with regards to water and what U.S. Corps is looking for. Over half an acre, you're looking at an individual permit. What this means to you, PCN, we're looking at probably be at a month, 2-month turnaround. Good on a good day.
It's a good submission.
on a good submission, no comments, that kind. IP, you're looking at about a year and a half. So those are things that we're identifying early on, identifying to the engineering team, to the design team, and saying, okay, this is what you're looking at. It's going to be about a year if we have to go that route. Endangered species concentrations. Early constraints will tell you if you're dealing with a lot of endangered species or a concentration of habitat for endangered species. If you see that, you just, if you know you're going to be dealing with a lot of endangered species, you're going to be looking at a consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. If any of you have gone through this process, that is something we don't have control over right now, is their review process, and so you might as well just pop in a year or more for that. And so by identifying those constraints, seeing if we can lessen any kind of impacts, we can maybe take off a little bit of time on those regards. Cultural resources, that's one of the things, you know, you just kind of initially plan for worst case scenario. You know, you go out and just kind of, you know, you could, with early constraints, especially for historics, there's enough materials out there that you're able to kind of identify if you're looking at a high probability area for significant cultural resources. Archaeology, you don't know. It's under the ground. There's probability mapping, but that's what it is. It's a probability. So, you know, our team, our subject matter experts, as well as some consultants out there can tell you the likelihood of finding artifacts and anything that can delay your project. So that's one of the things that we can discuss early on and maybe get a good guess at what kind of a level of investigation you're going to be needing. And then public involvement, controversial projects. You know, it all comes down to risk, and as was discussed earlier, how many of our projects have, you know, had any kind of legal challenges. And that's one of the things that you can look at the public involvement for. If there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of controversy with the project, that's one of the things that we're going to take our time to look at. We do with every resource, but it's just something that we double check and triple check just to make sure that we have our documentation and we've given that hard look that NEPA requires for each of those resources. All right, I ran through that kind of on purpose so that if you had any questions about some of these new tools that we can attempt to answer them. Do I have any? Yes?
I had a question. You brought up PLs and where PLs play a part in this process. Because
It's one of those tools that could be used in the PL process. It's not formally used, as I know of right now, by any of those long corridor projects or not. But what I'm more discussing is more the planning work that's done for identifying those projects for both the UTP kind of the STIP process and some of those local MTP planning documents that are going. Oh, okay. I think PEL is planning and environmental linkages. There's some new guidance and new FHWA regulations about involving PEL into the environmental process. They haven't really formally come out with any of that guidance yet, but I think this is one of our attempts to how we can bring some of that information. And it's mostly some of the planning documents that come in when you're establishing your purpose and need, which should be established at that planning part. So traffic numbers, population studies, things of that nature. But I mean, this tool can be used at any time.
I will say this. I will say this, Rob, that in terms of using that tool at a very early planning stage, you'll have asymmetrical value on the things that are negatives. You're going to be good on the things that are positives. You're going to have worst case scenario.
On the same tool, I guess the question would be, what is the minimum amount of information you're going to need? You've got a lot of information, I guess, on the slides that you showed. There would be no CSJ to begin with. There would be, just very basic information. So what is the basic information that you need to be able to use that form?
It was what? Okay, oh, sorry. What is the basic amount of information that you would need for the scope development tool? And that is a good thing about the tool, is that you can jump in with the very limited amount of information and it will give you, basically, if you don't know about a resource or you don't know the level of impacts for that resource, it's going to tell you to do that investigation. It seems like the more information that you do know is more of a way for it to eliminate needed items and resources. And then as far as not knowing the CSJ, there's different points when you can use this and when you can use that documentation. You can use that tool at any time. It may be for your own production team's knowledge, as a consultant for your own, coming up with your own proposals. When we start filling in CSJs and some of that other information, let me get to some of the other information, project descriptions and things like that. That point, when you know that information, that's when we're going to take it and use that documentation in scope development. But I mean, early on, you can use it. You can use it at any time. Is that about?
These two things right here, these district and county values, those values will change the content of the scope rather radically because there are regional issues, and so there are things that occur in specific counties that it's only relevant in those counties. And so what it will do is it'll eliminate those as things that you have to document and deal with. So there even some very, very basic information actually gets you down the road.
Eliminating coastal issues in El Paso, for example.
One of the things we use in our district is that this early constraints analysis, and the engineers are going to be looking at their early constraints analysis. If the environmental people are doing that at the same time, this tool is very helpful on guiding how that constraints analysis needs to be done, or should be done. And that's a tool that we use in our district, especially on the large projects, say corridor development projects there. So.
Well, to me, if I'm preparing something for a client, a county, a city, something like that, I really need to know roughly a little bit more, like I said, whether it's going to be a CS, ES, or EA or EIS, so I can give him an idea of the time frame that's going to take for the environment.
Well, that's a little bit backwards, because the environmental document level is based on impacts, not on location necessarily, or length, or things like that. So starting to develop these constraints analysis reports, these early constraints on the environmental constraints, is how we concentrate to move forward on a project to develop. Is it an EA? Is it a CE? Could it be a EIS even?
I don't know if you heard the question, but the idea, the question was, one of the early things you want to know is what level of documentation is needed for your study or for whatever project it is. And I think that's one of the habits that we've kind of gotten into, but if you read NEPA, an EA is essentially an assessment to determine if an EIS is needed. And we've gotten in that kind of habit of saying that's an EA, and then you kind of expect a FONSI, but the process is supposed to run out and let you know if you need to go to the impact statement, or whether your EA can end with the finding of no significant impacts, and that's the way we go. So, yeah, we do have, your classification letters and the back and forth on the determination of what level of document, but as I've always thought, that thing's probably is worth the paper that it's on, because your assessment should be telling you, what your impacts are.
One thing, always talk to your district, coordinate with your district person, and they can help you make any initial determinations on what type of documentation you might be needing. So communication is better than guessing.
Yeah.
Did you want to mention about the opening list and how that process?
Okay, I'll attempt it, but would you like to?
Sure.
Okay.
The question is, would we elaborate on something that is now called as the open-ended D categorical exclusion? The opening paragraph to subsection D in the federal reg allows us how this following list of 11 projects are examples of categorical exclusions. So the opening paragraph allows for there to be an including but not limited to use of the categorical exclusion. Open-ended D list approval authority is the name that FHWA lawyers give to that approval authority that's contained in that paragraph. So what it says then is that if you think that this project can be classified as a categorical exclusion, then go look at subparagraph A in the reg and meet those criteria, and then you have one. Okay. Now you need to have some sort of semi-historical basis for saying that this is a good candidate for it. We know that no new right-of-way projects in urban areas have a tendency to not have any significant impacts. So in other words, all these things that we used to do CE documents for FHWA, they were approving those as open-ended D. So that kind of project is the kind of project that qualifies. Does that got you, Shirley?
And I guess on just to elaborate on how that process is going to look like, if you're thinking that your project can meet those criteria, get a hold of project delivery, we'll discuss it, and then there'll be a classification request letter that comes through to us, and then our signature authority as a delegate, somebody at ENV, will determine if it's appropriate, and then we'll approve that approach. And then it becomes part of the district's responsibility at the CE level.